Unbeknownst to Neil, the amulet now sitting forgotten on his high shelf bore a profound connection to the very soil beneath his feet. Long before Charnwood became the farmstead he had always known, before Castlefields took its name, this land had been a place of power, a nexus where the boundaries between the natural world and something far older had thinned. Centuries ago, under moonlit skies, the cunning folk gathered here, their cloaks brushing against the damp earth as they whispered incantations into the night. They were seekers of forbidden knowledge, practitioners of rites learned through laborious study of grimoires passed down in secrecy. It was said that among these texts was the Book of Secrets, a work shrouded in myth and attributed to the famed Albertus Magnus. Though the origins of their knowledge were debated, the cunning folk believed their rituals could harness the currents of energy that coursed through this land, binding them to its essence. The amulet was no simple trinket. It had been forged not as an ornament, but as a vessel, a focal point for the forces the cunning folk sought to understand and command. The symbols etched onto its surface were not mere decorations, but carefully chosen inscriptions meant to protect, guide, and connect the bearer to the land's ancient memory. Over time, these rites faded into legend, their purpose eroded by the passage of generations. Yet the power they had drawn upon remained, silent and waiting, woven into the fabric of the land, and now held unknowingly in Neil's possession. The artifact appeared to be nothing more than a simple brooch with a golden yellow stone at its center. But it was anything but ordinary. To those who understood its true nature, it was an object of both worship and fear, a relic said to hold the key to unlocking immense power. The cunning folk revered it as a conduit, a focus for their craft, while others avoided even its mention, fearing the consequences of meddling with such forces. The brooch's origin was shrouded in mystery, its story scattered across fragmented accounts and whispered myths. It was said to have passed through countless hands, each owner marking its journey with secrets and blood. Its golden stone, though captivating, seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as though it trapped light within its depths. To some, it was an object of salvation. To others, a harbinger of doom. As Neil's restless dreams played out by the fire, the amulet sat on its high perch, seemingly inert yet quietly resonating with the echoes of those ancient ceremonies. It had found its way back to the soil that birthed it, and to the man whose destiny was intertwined with its dark legacy, though he remained oblivious, for now. Long before the castle loomed over the landscape, and before the land was touched by civilization, this region was a sprawling expanse of ancient forest. Towering oaks and gnarled yews formed a dense canopy, their roots entwining the earth like the veins of some sleeping giant. It was a place alive with whispers, an echo of the unseen forces said to linger just beyond human understanding. The cunning folk, revered and feared in equal measure, claimed this woodland as their sanctuary. Here, beneath the silver light of the moon, they conducted ceremonies that blurred the lines between reality and realms unknown. Through careful study of ancient writings, grimoires inked with cryptic symbols, passages of the famed Book of Secrets, whispered to hold the wisdom of Albertus Magnus, they sought to uncover the mysteries of existence. But they were not alone. Others, less cautious and more ambitious, also tread these paths, testing the boundaries of magic for power rather than understanding. Centuries had passed, the trees were felled, the cunning folk faded into memory, and the land was tamed. But an entity remained, bound by the failed ritual, yet seeping its influence into the weak and weary who came too close to its resting place. The amulet, crafted by the cunning folk as a conduit to darker realms, had never truly left the land. Though it had traveled around the world, passed from hand to hand, always hidden from ever-seeking eyes, its true home was here, tethered to the dark power that slumbered, waiting beneath the soil. The only thing capable of freeing this sinister force was a specific incantation, its words known only to those who dared delve into the most arcane and dangerous of texts, and an ancient artifact thought to be lost to time. One fateful night, when the forest was thick with fog and the air seemed alive with unspoken words, a group of practitioners dared to cross a line they barely understood. Their chants reverberated through the trees, carrying an unnatural resonance. The ground beneath their feet felt as though it pulsed, the fabric of reality stretching thin. They sought to summon an entity, something ancient, something powerful, and to bind it to their will. But summoning is no simple art. The magic bent but did not break. The sinister entity they called upon was dragged toward this reality, but resisted, clawing at the very seams of existence. The ritual went horribly wrong. Chaos erupted. Hooded figures scattered into the darkness, their chants dissolving into terrified screams as the air grew thick with the weight of their failure. All but one fled. In the shadows, a young girl lingered, her small frame swathed in a cloak that barely shielded her from the cold. At her feet stood a very small dog, its wiry fur trembling as it whimpered softly. The girl was drawn forward, as though the air itself compelled her, toward the circle's center. There, glowing faintly in the churned earth, lay the stone, its deep yellow light pulsing softly, calling to her. She dropped to her knees, hands reaching instinctively toward the artifact. Her head tilted back as if in surrender, and her eyes snapped open to reveal an unnatural fire, twin embers blazing with the very essence of the artifact. Her small frame seemed to radiate a strange, quiet power, as though the stone had chosen her for a purpose. The remaining shadows of the ritual swirled around her, whispering secrets only she could hear. Her dog let out a sharp, echoing yelp, its large eyes now glowing with the same golden fire, an otherworldly intensity that seemed to pierce through the thick forest air. And so it was that night, long ago, a quest was bestowed upon this little girl, one she did not ask for, but one that bound her irrevocably to the stone's dark will. Along with it came an unnatural gift, or curse. The dark magic of a prolonged life, extending far beyond what is natural or merciful. And on the day when an old woman, stooped and quiet, left Charnwood with her very small dog at her side, her mission, crafted in fire and shadow all those years ago, was at last complete. Over the following weeks and months, Neil's descent into despair was accompanied by a relentless cycle of drinking and fragmented sleep. Each night, as he succumbed to a whiskey or gin-induced haze, the amulet seemed to weave itself into his dreams. Faint whispers filled the space between waking and slumber, their words indistinguishable, yet imbued with a strange, haunting allure. In the dead of night, he would often wake drenched in sweat, clutching the amulet tightly to his chest, though he had no recollection of taking it off the shelf. The artifact held an unsettling power over him, its presence casting a dark shadow over his every thought. One evening, as heavy rain lashed against the windows, Neil drank indoors, the storm outside mirroring the tempest within him. 3 bottles deep, he wobbled on the stool, reaching for the shelf where the amulet and parchment lay. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper just as he lost his balance, sending him crashing to the floor. Dazed and disoriented, he lay on his back, watching the parchment slowly drift down, growing larger in his field of vision as his eyes closed. When he awoke, the fire had died, and a chill permeated the air. Sitting up, he noticed the piece of paper on the floor next to him, the amulet glinting under his chair. He picked them up, placing them on his bedside box. As he jumped into bed, he cast a glance at the box. The room plunged into darkness as he blew out the candle, and the dreams returned. In these dreams, the images became more direct. Rituals, words, and glyphs swirled in his mind, yet their meanings eluded him. The visions grew more vivid with each passing night, as though the amulet was drawing him closer to some inevitable, sinister conclusion. High above the coastline, a lone hawk soars on the wind, its keen eyes surveying the land far below. The settlement sprawls along the coast, like a patchwork quilt along the dark, restless sea. Tiny lights flicker along the shore, hinting at life within the clustered homes and weather-beaten shacks. The crescent-shaped bay cradles the settlement, its waves crashing rhythmically against the rocky shoreline, sending up plumes of salty mist. Further inland, the landscape undulates with rolling hills and parcels of land, dotted with patches of forest and the occasional solitary farmhouse. The roads, mere ribbons of earth, wind their way through the verdant countryside, connecting the settlement to the distant world beyond. As we descend, guided by the hawk's piercing gaze, the focus shifts to the edge of this rugged land, an open, ancient floodplain known to locals as castle fields. Within this expansive area lies CHARNWOOD, one of many plots of land, its weather-beaten farmstead standing in the shadow of the old castle, its origins shrouded in mystery, casting an imposing silhouette against the night sky. The trees here are bent and gnarled, their branches wind-swept by the cruel sea winds. Hidden within this bleak, remote outland, Neil's shack stands isolated, a lone sentinel against the encroaching darkness. As we move closer still, the dilapidated structure comes into view, its weathered timbers creaking in the wind. The small windows flicker with the warm glow of lamplight, standing in stark contrast to the storm raging outside. We draw nearer, hovering just outside a window, watching as the rain lashes against the glass, blurring the view of the room within. In the foggy recesses of his memory, Neil recalled a time when he was a wandering musician. Once he had stumbled upon a secluded grove deep within a forest, where he witnessed a group of people engaged in a ritual. Their chants resonated through the trees, the ancient words etched into his subconscious. Now, in his isolated shack, he half-heartedly attempted to recreate those arcane practices. Candles flickered on every surface, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The pungent aroma of burning sage filled the air, mingling with the sour tang of spilled wine. Neil muttered incantations from his dreams, their meanings lost to him, as he swayed on unsteady feet. Night after night, his rituals grew more elaborate, yet nothing ever seemed to happen. Frustration gnawed at him, driving him deeper into the bottle. He clutched the amulet, reciting words he did not understand, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. The artifact pulsed with a faint, eerie light, its power just beyond his grasp. As his efforts proved fruitless, Neil's frustration morphed into rage. Each empty bottle fueled his anger, the spirit of the drink and the dark energy of the amulet combining into a volatile mix. One night, he awoke outside on the cold, damp earth. Groggy and disoriented, he stumbled back to his shack. Pushing open the door, he was met with chaos. The room was in complete disarray, everything overturned and scattered across the floor. He pulled his hand from his pocket, the amulet lying cold and heavy in his palm. A new, fiery anger surged within him. "What a bloody fool I've been," he shouted, before hurling the artifact onto the floor in a fit of fury. Unnoticed by Neil, his drunken rituals and fevered incantations had indeed borne fruit, summoning an entity beyond the grasp of mortal comprehension. While he lay in the oblivion of sleep, something began to stir in the darkest corners of his home. It was a presence without form or name, an abyssal shadow that defied the very essence of light. It crept along the walls, an intangible malignancy, feeding off the latent energies that Neil had unwittingly unleashed. The air grew thick with a malevolent charge, the very atmosphere seeming to pulse with a sinister heartbeat. In the dead of night, when the world was at its quietest, the shadow swelled and contracted, a formless mass that seemed to breathe with an unholy life. It whispered from the void, a cacophony of voices that echoed in the periphery of Neil's consciousness, intertwining with his nightmares. The darkness seemed to grow sentient, twisting and writhing as if testing the boundaries of its newfound domain. And so, the malign force bided its time, lurking in the shadows, its unseen eyes ever watchful. It fed on Neil's despair, his rage, and his growing obsession with the amulet. With each passing night, it grew stronger, more defined, awaiting the moment when it would fully manifest and unleash its dread upon the world. As the sinister presence wove itself into the fabric of Neil's existence, it remained hidden by day, its dark essence slumbering in the shadows. But by night it came alive, weaving intricate patterns in the realm of Neil's dreams. Each night, as Neil drifted into restless sleep, his dreams became a stage for the entity's machinations. Strange, ethereal instruments appeared before him, metallic harps and lutes that shimmered with an otherworldly light. Their strings vibrated with an unsettling energy, producing sounds that grew louder with each passing moment. Thunderous tones filled his dreams, a symphony of screaming and sweeping waves of sound that defied description. The cacophony created a kaleidoscope of images, each more beautiful and haunting than the last. Neil's mind was a canvas upon which the entity painted its dark masterpieces, using sound as its brush. These visions left Neil both enthralled and terrified. He awoke each morning with fragments of melodies and images lingering in his mind, their beauty tainted by an undercurrent of dread. The entity's influence grew stronger with each passing night, its grip on Neil's subconscious tightening like a vice. As the sounds and images intertwined with the very essence of his character, Neil found himself drawn deeper into the abyss. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and he became a puppet in the hands of an unseen, malevolent force. In Neil's ever-building dreams, arpeggios cascaded like falling stars, landing in a crystal lake and rippling out to him. These celestial tones wove intricate patterns and soundscapes of heavenly delight, enveloping him in a rare, soothing feeling. Despite the growing darkness, Neil prayed for the solace these sounds brought, their ethereal beauty a fleeting respite from the sinister forces at play. One sunlit morning, Neil awoke to a strange humming sound emanating from the other room. Groggy and disoriented, he rubbed his eyes, the remnants of his dreams still lingering in his mind. The hum was persistent, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of his shack. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Neil made his way to the door, each step heavy with the weight of his recent experiences. The closer he got, the more the sound grew, intensifying until it filled the entire space with an almost palpable presence. With a mix of curiosity and unease, Neil pushed open the door. His breath caught in his throat, as he stepped into the room, the strange humming sound growing louder, almost spiritual. Before him lay something utterly strange, a sleek, stringed object resting against the table. Its polished surface gleamed under the dim candlelight, reflecting an eerie, almost magical glow. Beside it, a box of sorts hummed softly. A small red light in the corner of the box pulsated. Neil's eyes widened in surprise and disbelief. He reached out tentatively, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the instrument. When he finally made contact, he recoiled, not knowing what to expect. As he stood there staring at it, a familiarity swept through him. Slowly he gathered his courage and picked up the object. The instrument felt strangely familiar in his hands, as if it had been crafted specifically for him. Yet, he had never seen anything like it before. The weight and balance were perfect, and the thin strings seemed to hum with an energy all their own. The box's hum resonated with a low, almost sentient frequency, filling the room with an unearthly ambience. Neil's heart raced, a mixture of fear and awe tightening his chest. He believed these never-before-seen things were the result of his recent esoteric practices and the rituals he had attempted. Inspired by his apparent success, Neil resolved to continue his dark experiments. He prepared the necessary things to perform more rituals, eager to confirm his success. All the while, the unseen darkness that was infecting his shack manipulated his actions from the shadows, furthering its sinister agenda. Over time, Neil's small shack transformed into a labyrinth of wires, instruments, and blinking lights. He had accumulated an entire studio dedicated to manipulating and processing the sounds he was creating. Without questioning how he knew what these objects were or how to use them, Neil instinctively operated each one with an uncanny familiarity. Among his collection was a peculiar device capable of recalling and playing back the music he had composed. Neil's days and nights blurred into one long, unbroken stretch of creation. He stayed awake for days at a time, driven by an insatiable need to produce more music. Only when his body gave out did he collapse, only to resume his work as soon as he awoke. His small space was cluttered with keyboards, guitars, and drum machines, their tangled cords snaking across the floor. Two monstrous speakers stood on either side of a mixing desk, towering over the chaotic scene. Sometimes, Neil would sit close to the speakers, mesmerized by the way they vibrated and oscillated with the frequencies of the sound. Music had always been Neil's greatest passion, a solace greater than anything else. The gifts he found himself with now seemed like a divine blessing, a reward for all the hardship he had endured. The music consumed him entirely, banishing memories of his past life, of misery and sadness. Neil was totally unaware of the unseen darkness that was Cornelius, watching and waiting, delighting in his growing obsession. The more Neil immersed himself in the music, the stronger the entity's hold became, its insidious influence weaving through every note and rhythm he created. In the back of his mind, Neil believed he was special, chosen even. The thought of being blessed with such extraordinary gifts fueled his relentless drive. He reveled in the music he created, each note a testament to his newfound abilities. The instruments, the sounds, the knowledge, all of it felt like a divine gift bestowed upon him. But all the while, from the darkest corners of his home, he was being observed. Cornelius, the unseen darkness, watched with a malevolent delight. In sleep, Neil was pushed and prodded, his dreams manipulated to delve deeper into his so-called blessing. Night after night, the entity's whispers grew stronger, guiding Neil's hand in his waking hours. Neil's obsession blinded him to the truth. He saw his relentless drive as a sign of his uniqueness, his destiny. Little did he know, each step he took brought him closer to the abyss. Cornelius knew the time was close. The malevolent force bided its time, feeding off Neil's belief in his own specialness, waiting for the moment when it could fully seize control. Neil's obsession grew as he spent countless hours tuning the strange stringed instrument, an object that seemed almost alive in his hands. He experimented feverishly, twisting the strings until their vibrations produced a deep, guttural resonance. Each adjustment pulled forth a sound that felt both ancient and alien, as if the instrument itself held memories of some otherworldly harmony. Using one of the peculiar devices he had conjured during his restless rituals, Neil found a way to corrupt the sound even further. The signal passing through the machine emerged warped and layered, a cacophony of distorted tones. It was a noise unlike any he had heard before, dense, metallic, and primal. Pairing these sounds with frenetic, pounding rhythms that erupted from his drum box, Neil unknowingly birthed a style of music that would one day be revered and feared. Then there was the screaming. At first, it was a shrill, accidental wail that pierced his shack and sent a shiver down his spine. The enormous speakers would emit these pained cries whenever Neil ventured too close with his instrument. But as he played more, the screams became predictable, controllable. He learned to manipulate the feedback, twisting the once painful sound into something hauntingly beautiful. High-pitched wails gave way to eerie soundscapes that ebbed and flowed, saturating the air with an oppressive presence. The walls of the shack trembled under the weight of these dark melodies, and the sound seemed to bleed into the land beyond. The night creatures fell silent, as if in reverence or fear. Neil, enraptured by the aural landscapes he conjured, never noticed the faint shadow coiling around the edges of the room, listening, growing stronger. In those moments of creation, Neil believed he was truly blessed. But in the shadows, Cornelius smiled. The feeling of being blessed, once a constant hum in Neil's thoughts, had long since dissolved. In its place surged a deeper, primal sensation, one of pure power. The sheer volume of the music, the way it trembled through his hands and radiated into the world around him, was intoxicating. Each note was his weapon, each reverberation his dominion. With every distorted chord and unearthly wail, Neil felt his control solidify. He began to realize the impact his sound could have on those who heard it. This was not merely music, it was a force. He knew, deep in his core, that people would fear what he had created. But that fear thrilled him. It was a fear he could wield, shape, and amplify. The oppressive weight of the sound, the raw energy that poured from the speakers, was his and his alone to command. There was power in that, dark and undeniable. The shack had become his sanctum, a place where the noise lived and thrived. It was no longer just the walls that contained the sound. It was the air, the earth, the very fabric of the night. Neil stood at the center of it all, his instrument slung low in his hands, the feedback screaming as he conjured landscapes of noise and chaos. And as the darkness seemed to thicken around him, Neil's thoughts were no longer of gratitude, but of dominion. Unseen and unnoticed, the shadow that was Cornelius coiled tighter, feeding off Neil's burgeoning hubris. In the depths of that shack, where sound and shadow collided, something far older and more malevolent stirred. Neil believed he was in control, but control was a fleeting thing in the presence of such ancient darkness. Neil had always harbored a thinly veiled disdain for the simple folk who lived in the shadows of Castlefields. He viewed their drab lives as an affront to his newfound grandeur, their narrow minds incapable of grasping the brilliance of his creations. But he was no fool. He knew the whispers of suspicion carried quickly in this superstitious community, and if his unearthly music ever reached their ears, it would be his undoing. Witchcraft, they would cry. Heresy, burn him, they would bellow. The thought of such accusations, coupled with the malice etched into his neighbors' faces, was enough to make Neil tread carefully. He knew they would relish the sight of him tied to a stake, his so-called blessing reduced to ashes. So he devised a way to protect himself and his creations. Amongst the peculiar instruments and devices that littered his shack, he discovered a curious contraption, a set of cups placed snugly over his ears, connected by wires to his machine. When he donned the device, he found he could still hear the thunderous roar of his music, louder than ever, without a single sound escaping into the world outside. The heavy tones and spectral wails reverberated directly into his mind, a private symphony of power and darkness. For Neil, it was liberation. He could revel in the force of his creation without the prying ears of the outside world. He could listen as loud as he dared, alone in his fortress of noise. Cornelius, ever watchful, was deeply amused by this new arrangement. The entity delighted in Neil's growing paranoia and isolation, for it played perfectly into his plans. The cacophony of Neil's heavy metal noise resonated not just through the shack, but through the fabric of existence itself, a frequency Cornelius found irresistibly nourishing. Soon, it would no longer be Neil guiding the flow of this dark sound. Soon, it would be Cornelius's indulgence. From the unseen corners of the room, a low chuckle echoed faintly, intertwining with the oppressive tones that enveloped Neil. He didn't hear it. He was too absorbed in his own illusion of mastery. Cornelius grinned in the dark, content to let his pawn revel in his power for the time being. The farmstead had grown quiet, too quiet. Days bled into nights, and Neil found solace in neither. Shadows stretched longer than they should, and every creak of the timber felt like a whisper of things unseen. Supplies had dwindled to an alarming state. Not that Neil hadn't noticed, but leaving the farmstead felt perilous. Still, necessity could not be ignored. With a heavy sigh, Neil finally resolved to make the journey to the village. He began his preparations in the cold, early light of morning, his breath fogging as he gathered what he could. His satchel, patched and worn, barely held the weight of the few coins he would carry, meager remnants of a once prosperous existence. He made a list in his head, coarse grains for pottage, the starchy sustenance that kept him alive, a slab of salted game to savor, if any hunter still dared the woods. But most importantly, a case of gin, the fiery liquid that dulled the incessant whispers that plagued his nights. The thought of the gin brought a flash of something close to pleasure, a rare reprieve in these relentless days. Neil tried not to dwell on why the thought felt planted, like a seed in the fertile soil of his mind. He tightened the straps of his satchel and steeled himself. The village beckoned with its promises of necessities and unknown events. Neil cast a wary glance at the small sack of dried mushrooms resting atop the table. The leathery fungi had become his silent allies in survival, an unassuming currency in a world that seemed to grow stranger by the day. Coin was sparse, nearly non-existent, but these peculiar offerings carried a value far beyond their weight. People whispered of their properties, some claiming medicinal use, others speaking in hushed tones of visions and strange dreams. Whatever the reason, villagers were eager to trade for them. He carefully tucked the mushrooms into his pack, securing it among the few trinkets and sellable items. With luck, he could barter for enough grains, a cut of game, and that all-important case of gin to last through the weeks ahead. Maybe, just maybe, he'd even manage to jump a cart on the way back, saving his legs and avoiding the pressing questions of those who might grow curious about his business. As he fastened his cloak, Neil couldn't shake the feeling that the mushrooms themselves weren't entirely innocent in their growing appeal. After all, their influence seemed to be a necessary part of his life. Could it be mere coincidence, or was the fungus yet another seed growing in the recesses of his mind, planted by long, dark fingers? Neil closed the door of his shack with a deliberate push, the worn hinges creaking as if bidding him farewell. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in streaks of pale orange and gold, casting long shadows over the uneven ground. Strapped across his back was a large sack, its weight a constant reminder of the supplies he hoped to secure. He adjusted its straps with a grim determination and set off along the road. The journey to Myrtle Village stretched some 8 miles, a lonely, weathered path cutting through the rolling moors. The road was straight, uncompromising, and ancient, carved long ago by hands now forgotten. The only route from this direction, it carried an aura of inevitability, as if it too were guiding Neil toward his unseen fate. The wind shifted occasionally, carrying with it the briny scent of the nearby sea, a faint promise of life beyond the barren landscape. The morning was uncharacteristically dry, and the sun hung low, gleaming through scattered tufts of clouds. Those fluffy forms drifted lazily across the high expanse of sky, their peaceful movement contrasting sharply with the storm that stirred in Neil's mind. Each step fell in rhythm with the persistent crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the sound oddly soothing in the vast silence. As the village drew closer, a subtle unease began to settle over him, like a shadow trailing just beyond his vision. Yet the road remained quiet, the air serene, and the world deceivingly normal. Neil forced his thoughts back to the practicalities of his trip, bartering mushrooms, securing provisions, and perhaps finding a cart for the return journey. The walk would test his endurance, but he comforted himself with the notion that Myrtle Village would offer relief, however fleeting. The soft clattering of wheels and the faint jingle of harness rings broke the silence behind him. Neil paused, twisting his head to look back. A small cart emerged from the crest of the hill, its wooden wheels creaking over the gravel road. A long-eared donkey trudged ahead, its movement steady but weary, tugging the modest load forward. The passengers, 2 figures bundled in threadbare cloaks, sat hunched, their faces partly obscured by the shadows of their hoods. As the cart drew closer, Neil stepped to the side of the road to let them pass. He offered a slight nod, a simple acknowledgement born of habit rather than thought. The travelers, however, met his gesture with cold disdain. Their eyes lingered on him, sharp and piercing, yet filled with something that stung more than indifference. Suspicion? Contempt? Neil couldn't quite place it, but the gaze unsettled him. Without a word or a change in expression, they rolled past, leaving only the rhythmic clatter of their cart behind. "Fuck you, then," Neil muttered under his breath, pulling his cloak tighter as he resumed his walk. Yet the interaction gnawed at the edges of his mind. Their faces, or what little he had seen of them, sparked an uncomfortable familiarity. Had he crossed paths with them before? He was sure of it. But where and why did the memory elude him? But the further Neil walked, the more their expression seemed etched into his thoughts. It wasn't merely disdain. It felt loaded, as though they knew something about him that he himself had yet to grasp. the nagging unease settled over him like a heavy mist, thickening the atmosphere of the already lonely road. A small river meandered lazily around the outer edge of Myrtle Village, its waters glinting softly under the midday sun. A simple wooden bridge arched across it, weathered by time, but sturdy enough to bear the weight of passing carts. Neil, however, avoided the bridge, veering down the embankment instead. He preferred the quiet sanctuary beneath, away from prying eyes and unspoken questions. Crouching by the stream, he dipped his bottle into the cool, clear water, watching as ripples distorted the reflection of the world above. As the ripples stilled, a faint shape caught his attention. A face. He paused, leaning closer, his breath mingling with the river's chill. For a moment, he thought it was a trick of the light, or the water bending the image in strange ways. But no, it was his face. And yet, it wasn't. Neil frowned, peering harder into the stillness of a nearby pool. What stared back was unsettlingly unfamiliar. His eyes, once bright and sharp, now seemed sunken, deeply set into his face, with a faint yellowish hue that made them glimmer like tarnished brass. His lips, thin and cracked, drew dark lines against his pale skin, as though sketched by an unsteady hand. Time and neglect had changed him, surely, but this felt different, as though the man staring back was someone he could barely recognize. A creeping unease prickled at the edges of his thoughts. How long had it been since he last truly looked at himself? Days? Weeks? Months? He couldn't remember. Neil shook his head, dismissing the feeling with a short laugh. "Getting too much into your own head," he muttered aloud, as if saying it would make it true. He capped the bottle with a firm twist and rose, brushing the dirt from his knees. Without a second glance at the stream, he slung the sack over his shoulder and continued toward the village. The face in the water lingered in his mind's eye, but Neil chose to ignore it. There were more pressing matters at hand, matters far more real than a fleeting reflection. Before long, Neil found himself threading through the narrow streets of Myrtle Village, where the buildings leaned in close, casting jagged shadows across the cobblestones. The air was alive with the clamor of voices, merchants hawking their wares, children shrieking in play, and villagers arguing prices or swapping gossip. It was a ceaseless, chaotic melody that wrapped around him, overwhelming after the lonely silence of the road. The smells were as varied as the sounds. The acrid tang of wood smoke mingled with the sweet, yeasty aroma of fresh bread. Here and there, hints of salt air from the distant sea wafted through, soon smothered by the stink of livestock penned in a nearby corner. Neil kept his head low as he moved through the throng, his sack bouncing lightly against his back. People bustled about their business, hardly sparing him a glance, at least not openly. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes brushing over him, lingering just a moment too long. A few villagers edged away as he passed, others muttered to themselves, their words lost in the din. He told himself it was nothing, just small-town wariness toward an outsider they did not recognize. And yet, it didn't feel like nothing. He shook off the thought, focusing instead on the task at hand. The market stalls sprawled ahead, a riot of colors and noise. If he could barter his mushrooms wisely, he might leave with a full sack and just enough energy to spare for the long walk home, or better yet, a cart to jump. He had a good trade, his gin was sent on to the nearby stables, he even had a few coins left. Neil adjusted the weight of his now full sack. His trading was done, his needs met, but the lure of the village was not so easily ignored. He found himself drawn into Myrtle Village's less-traveled back streets as twilight unfurled like an ink-stained tapestry across the sky. A flickering light beckoned him from a modest establishment, its doorway slightly ajar, inviting and ominous in equal measure. The tavern's glow seeped through cracks, painting amber strokes on cobblestones, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Through half-lidded eyes, Neil watched shadows dance like spectral puppets against the walls within. Inside, laughter and clinking glasses rose to meet him in a warm embrace of sound, an inviting melody that mingled with hushed tones, carrying fragments of tales, both ordinary and otherworldly. The atmosphere was thick with an intoxicating blend of camaraderie and mystery. The air inside the tavern was heavy, laden with whispers from corners where shadows clung like cobwebs to ancient beams overhead. Neil pushed open the door, its creak a soft announcement to those gathered within, a chorus that paused momentarily before resuming their symphony of murmurs and mirth. He stepped in, his presence causing heads to turn subtly, as if drawn by some unseen current beneath consciousness itself. He paid little mind to their glances. Rather, he was entranced by the hum of shared stories and collective forgetfulness that permeated the room like an elixir. His own thoughts were a distant murmur, a whisper drowned in the sea of voices around him. His eyes caught glimpses of his reflection in darkened windows, those peculiarly yellowed irises, seemingly lit from within by some unseen flame. A gaunt visage stared back at him through sunken cheeks, yet all he perceived was an echo, a shadow of himself. Yet there was an influence that pulled him deeper into this haven. With enough coin to purchase a few drinks, Neil approached the bar, a weathered counter etched with history. A stout man wiped a cloth half-heartedly across the counter, his bushy eyebrows lifting as Neil approached.
"What'll it be?"
he grunted, eyeing Neil with an expression of mild disinterest. Neil placed a coin on the counter, its dull gleam catching the firelight. "Something strong," Neil replied, his voice rougher than he intended. He leaned on the bar, the sack hanging heavily from his shoulder. As the barkeep slid a tankard his way, Neil let his gaze wander, absorbing the tavern's energy. Here, among the merry faces and echoing voices, he felt a rare sense of normalcy, however fleeting it might prove to be. Neil found an empty table. He sat to enjoy his ale. The tavern's din swirled around him, a tapestry of laughter and slurred voices. Neil felt an unsettling shift within himself. Gaspar, a burly man with eyes clouded by spirits more than clarity, approached Neil. His gait was unsteady, yet purposeful, as he navigated the sea of patrons. The tavern's cacophony seemed to hush momentarily around them. Muffled conversations and laughter faded into the background as Gaspar fixed his gaze on Neil with a predatory intensity. Gaspar leaned forward, his breath reeking of ale and malice.
"You think you're better than us, eh?"
he growled, his voice cutting through the tavern's din. He leaned in even closer, his breath hot and sour.
"Sitting there all quiet, like you're too good to join the rest of us."
Neil barely glanced up, hoping to avoid whatever trouble the man was brewing. He remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't respond, didn't even look at the man. But inside, something shifted. Inside Neil's head, a voice erupted, a cacophonous scream that clawed at the edges of his consciousness.
"Kill him now!"
Its command reverberated within, overpowering all reason and will. Neil's body stiffened as if turned to stone by an invisible hand. Turning his head, his eyes transformed before Gaspar's incredulous gaze. Once soft grey, now deepening into a sickly yellow hue, the pupils narrowing to pinpricks that seemed to pierce through Gaspar's drunken soul. The tavern erupted in chaos, a cacophony of screams slicing through the once jovial atmosphere as patrons scattered like leaves before a storm. Their eyes widened in horror at the unfolding scene at Neil's table. Gaspar, caught off guard, struggled futilely against Neil's ironclad grip, his voice dissipated into panicked gasps and pitiful sobs, unintelligible under Neil's relentless grip. Neil felt nothing, his consciousness distant from his actions, as if watching a play where he was both director and actor. Yet the force exerted by his hands that held Gaspar's head seemed to stem from an inexhaustible well of energy, a power he neither understood nor controlled entirely. As Gaspar's body began to tremble under Neil's unyielding pressure, his thumbs placed over the eye sockets, as shadows around him darkened further, swirling as if responding to a hidden command. Each movement felt orchestrated, choreographed in the depths of his subconscious by some evil. The final thrust deep into the skull was decisive, a silent crescendo that sealed Gaspar's fate. With dark blood flowing down Neil's forearms, the man crumpled soundlessly to the floor at his feet, Neil's grip releasing almost immediately after, the connection severed like an extinguished flame. Silence followed swiftly, a stark contrast to the pandemonium moments before. A few remaining patrons remained frozen in their tracks, disbelief suspended in time as they processed the scene before them. Neil stood motionless, looking down at Gaspar's inert form, his own body rigid with tension and adrenaline. The voice inside him waned, receding like a tide pulling away from shore. Neil made his way to the cobblestone street outside the tavern, a world away from its chaotic interior, yet eerily quiet in comparison. His gaze fell to his hands, pale and trembling as they clutched each other, dark blood stains seeping through his skin. The sight of blood was jarring against their pallor, trickling steadily like shadows fleeing the light. There was an unsettling absence of sound, an eerie silence that pressed upon him from all sides. Suddenly, in a delayed reaction, horror gripped Neil as he looked down at his hands. They were alien to him now, marred by a darkness far removed from anything mundane or explainable. Each drop of blood seemed like a whispering accusation, urging recognition but delivering none. That strange inner voice re-emerged, an unwelcome guest within the recesses of his mind. It was cold and sharp as ice, slicing through Neil's confusion with surgical precision.
That fool asked for trouble,
It rasped dismissively.
and that's what he got.
The drunken stranger, Gaspar, the man who had provoked this chaos, was now nothing more than an afterthought, his presence reduced to a grim tableau against the backdrop of Neil's internal struggle. The voice continued, its tone devoid of empathy or warmth.
You will learn to enjoy my little games.
It declared with unsettling certainty. Neil's mind reeled as he tried to reconcile this revelation with his own fractured sense of self. Memories flickered like distant stars, fragments that hinted at a musical lust, a new-found peace obscured by layers upon layers of deceit and manipulation. As the cold night air wrapped around him, he grappled with questions, demanding answers. What was this voice? What truths lay hidden beneath his own skin? And most pressing of all, how did this fit into the way he felt and the powerful music he found himself obsessed with? The commotion of the tavern faded as Neil walked the winding path toward the stables, his sack slung over his shoulder, feeling heavier with each step. The evening moonlight stretched long shadows across the ground. The hum of the village behind him was gradually replaced by the soft rustle of trees lining the road. He welcomed the quiet. It gave him space to think, or rather, to not think. He needed to escape the noise both around and within. The stables sat on the outskirts, tucked near the edge of the village where the road stretched back toward Castlefields. A battered sign creaked on rusty hinges above the stable doors, the weathered lettering barely legible. The place had seen better days. The stone walls were flecked with moss, and the scent of hay and sweat hung thick in the air. Soft murmurs and clinks from within mingled with the rhythmic clop of hooves as animals were tended to by their caretakers. Neil scanned the area, his eyes settling on a pair of carts idling near the road. Their drivers were busy loading sacks of grain, barrels and crates, pausing only to mutter brief exchanges. Neil had his crate of gin delivered here earlier that day. He knew this was a good place to find a ride, assuming he could barter his way into a space among the goods. Charnwood was close enough, but the weight of the incident, and the weight of something heavier, less tangible, had drained him of the energy for a full walk back. Neil let the sack slide from his shoulder with a dull thud onto the patchy earth outside the shack. The journey had drained him, but the sight of home brought a flicker of solace. His lips curved into a faint smile as small birds, bold with familiarity, fluttered closer, their tiny eyes bright with expectation. They hopped and chirped, darting toward the sack in search of crumbs, their delicate presence a rare, grounding comfort. This place, hidden within the shadowy borders of Castlefields, had become his sanctuary. The twisted oaks and dense undergrowth concealed it from prying eyes, offering a haven far removed from the chaos of the village and the noise of the wider world. Neil exhaled deeply, his breath fogging in the cool evening air. Here, among the quiet hum of nature, he could almost forget the weight that pressed against his soul. Almost. Inside the shack, the air felt heavier, though Neil didn't notice it consciously. The walls, marked by the years, seemed to lean inward as though listening, holding secrets too vast for their wooden frames. The unseen force of Cornelius's presence coiled and pulsed in the shadows, unnoticed yet insidious. It lingered in the corners, in the spaces between breaths, waiting with a patience that defied comprehension. Neil crossed the threshold, unaware of the darkness that wrapped around his sanctuary, biding its time. He fed the birds a handful of crumbs from his pocket before stepping inside, the fleeting smile already fading from his face.